This is Melissa Newcomb with my Module 9 case study. I started this case study by imagining a cast of characters. I gave them faces for this case study. The case study was very realistic, and so I included Principal Inman, James and David, both students, a teacher, a school officer, James's mom, David's mom, and a director of secondary education. We're going to start by looking at the facts of this case study and summarizing the case. Assistant Principal Inman worked hard to establish a relationship with his students from the South Side, in particular with James. James had prior issues at school, but Principal Inman's diligence in building a relationship has paid off with positive results in behavior and academics for James and other Southside students. Principal Inman called James to the office for an accumulation of tardies, but before James arrived, a teacher called to report a suspicious interaction she observed between James and another student. David Ramos, please note that David has had no other prior issues at school and has held a sound reputation amongst his teachers and peers. The teacher suspected that drugs were exchanged between James and David. Principal Inman called James and David. David was escorted by a school officer to the office and held a conference with all three persons present. James confessed that he only asked David to hold something for him. David became nervous and cried, not wanting to speak, and the school officer searched David and found brass knuckles, a prohibited weapon, on school grounds. James admitted fault and confessed that the knuckles were his and that he was going to use them after school. He only asked David to hold them. He actually threatened David and told him he would hurt him if he gave the knuckles up. Principal Inman thought the school officer would not charge David with these accusations and dismiss him. However, because having this weapon on school grounds is a felony possession with a zero-tolerance school board, David and James both get charged. Principal Inman calls both mothers. James's mom responded by hoping her son learns a lesson in the youth detention facility. David's mom is panicked, which turns to anger, and she came to the school within 15 minutes of the phone call. She demanded to know why her son was charged when the other student confessed to owning and placing the knuckles. Principal Inman filled out paperwork on James, but decided that David had been an innocent victim and tore up David's paperwork. 1 week after the event, David was back in class and James was at the detention facility. The director of secondary education called Principal Inman and commanded him to follow through with the papers on David, or Principal Inman would be reprimanded and his professional file would state that he had been reprimanded. It would have record of this. This next slide, I know that my images are kind of silly and maybe minimize this case study. I intended not to do that. That was not my intention. This case study is actually extremely sobering and difficult and very realistic. Principal Inman is left with a sobering and difficult decision to call. Does he go against the director of secondary education and not fill out the paperwork on David and risk being reprimanded in his own professional file? Let's start by checking out any legal or ethical issues. Has anyone been harmed by the action or the decision of another? And if so, in what way? Well, David, his mom, and James all were harmed by Principal Inman when he made the decision to call David into his office with James and the officer. Some preliminary investigation should have taken place before including the officer. Principal Inman should have spoken with the students individually before the officer's involvement. He failed to consider all the possible consequences for everyone involved. I know that I am guilty of doing that, calling kids together and finding out what is going on when there has been a complaint from the two of them. Because of this case study, I will probably never do that again. David was harmed further because he now holds a record to contend with the rest of his life. And the law labels the possession of a weapon as a felony, and the school labels the possession with a 45-day expulsion. So, summing up this case study in one sentence, what is happening here? Failing to consider all of the consequences for everyone involved and rushing to a decision to include the officer in the first conversation has led to serious harm to David, mistrust and betrayal from David's mom, and more harm to James. Let's look at the facts about the people and then the places and the program. There's facts and then there's unknown things. I'm a little worried about time. I'm going to look here at the facts on people and then point out some of the unknowns. So the facts. Principal Inman, he was in his first year as an assistant principal. He grew up on the South Side. He developed a relationship with James and other South Side students, but specifically with James. James was a 15-year-old, he's strong-build, tattoos, rides the bus. He does have prior offenses, has been doing well recently, and admitted to making David hold the weapon. He was charged. David is a 13-year-old. He's a scholar, a band member. He has a slight build. He was escorted by the officer and was caught holding the weapon and was charged. The officer is pretty self-explanatory. James's mom does not seem to care, at least not with her words. David's mom is very upset and angry. The officer, I will say, his job is to uphold the law. The secondary director becomes involved 1 week later and tells principal that he must fill out the paperwork on David and that he will be reprimanded if not. Some of the unknown facts on Principal Inman: we don't know his race. We don't know if he was biased to the South Side students, namely James. James, we don't know his race, but I also wonder, and it's not known, if James and David either had fathers in their lives. Like, none of the fathers were called. So anyway, wondering if fathers are in their lives. We don't know if they've had some kind of a relationship, James and David, in the past. Is there a history between the two of them? Has James bullied other people? Has David been bullied in the past by someone else? James's mom and David's mom, we don't know their race. Secondary director, unknown race. Looking at the places, what are the facts? They're in a school building. It's a suburban area. There's diversity in the socioeconomic status of the students. The South Side does not seem to be a privileged area the way that Principal Inman spoke about it. We don't know, though, the demographics. We don't know the specific city and location. We don't know the condition of the school building. Is it old? Is it new? Is it run down? The program. We know that the students are 13 and 15, some of the students. We know there's 900 students. We know there's a band program, that there was a Christmas band concert, that there's busing, there's recreational basketball before school, there's a scholars program. We do not know if it's a public or private school. It could be a remediate school. Like, we don't know the specific grade levels for David and James. After looking at these things, though, the facts and the unknowns, and considering these things and the relationships between people, let's review and prioritize. Think of the important stakeholders. Principal Inman is a stakeholder. James, David, the parents of all of the students, the other students that are like David. If this could happen to David, could this happen to me? Could I be like wrongfully accused, or like could a kid tell me he's going to beat me up, and then if I rat on him about this and I have the weapon, could I be, have a record now? And the teachers may fear reporting. Principal Inman has two choices. He can file the papers on David and bring great harm to David's future, cause mistrust in his school community, but protect his own name professionally. Or he cannot file the papers on David and advocate for David in a legal process, restore trust in the parents, but go against his own superior and be reprimanded in his professional file. Sadly, Principal Inman cannot go back in time. If he had paused for a moment and considered all of the severe consequences so many would face, the outcome surely would be different. Notifying the building principal and higher administration would be critical in this situation, and the sooner the better. Principal Newcomb, you have three options. One, do nothing. I never feel like this is a good idea. To remain stagnant as a leader is not good. It can actually bring about more harm and bring people to question your integrity and trust. Option two, you can fill out the paperwork or don't fill out the paperwork. As a leader, I would take my own consequences completely out of this option and solely focus on others. Also, option three, seek guidance. I would seek counsel from my building principal. I'm the assistant principal. Go to him, explain the situation, talk through it. I might also look into options that might be able to help David and possibly help James by lessening his consequences. Now, next, we're going to look at the pros and cons of these options. I'm going to look at option number two, to fill out the paperwork or not fill out the paperwork. So the first one says, fill out the paperwork on David and meet with the mentors to seek best interest of all involved. I came up with very little pros on this and more cons, as you can see. And then the second option, do not fill out the paperwork on David and meet with the mentors to seek the best interests for all involved. I came up with more pros than cons on that decision. So with that being said, and with looking at the facts, reviewing and prioritizing, checking the pros and cons, looking at the legal and ethical issues involved, Principal Newcomb, choose your best option. This case study actually made my stomach hurt. It's so realistic, and it could easily happen. It was kind of troubling to me, and I'm very thankful for my administrators who work on a daily basis making choices like this. Teachers do too. We make choices to report things, to not report things, in the way that we handle things. But as educational leaders, we must pause and take time to carefully evaluate our options and the consequences that each choice could potentially cause. When making a final decision for this case, I had to remember my moral compass and not stray from it. It is equally important to put others before myself and examine the potential harms that my decisions might cause to them. Closely examining all of my options and creating an ethical framework of pros and cons for each option helped me to clarify my decision. So, Principal Newcomb, what is your ethical choice? I would choose to not file the report on David and to advocate for what is ethically in his best interest. And in doing so, I believe that I would be cultivating an ethical school community by modeling high ethical standards. How would you do this? Step one, I would not file the paperwork on David. I would contact the building principal and higher administration, let the director of secondary education know your decision, my decision, and that you must stand by your code of ethics and cannot accuse David of fault, and know that you may be reprimanded. Step two, I would gather all the information and evidence needed to support my decision, meet with higher administration, and advocate for David and James by admitting his own fault and admitting my fault as well in handling the situation. I would seek to reach out to James and commend him for his admission of guilt and continue the relationship that has been developed. Step three, I would openly address the teachers and staff on any decision. I would meet with any other legal parties that need addressed, meet with David's mother to apologize, and hopefully seek restoration and trust ultimately. In the last few seconds, this case study demonstrates how difficult ethical decision-making can be. Educational leaders must be able to carefully examine multiple options for handling complex situations with integrity, caring for all people involved. They must be able to implement and model ethical practices in their school community, shaping a safe, nurturing, and virtuous environment for all. Thank you.